Hey guys, welcome back to another Atlas Archives journey, where tonight we're venturing into the heart of Africa itself, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. If you've ever wondered what it's like to explore a country that's basically the size of all of Western Europe, but with only one paved road for every area the size of Belgium, well, you're about to find out. The Congo isn't just big, it's almost comically massive, sitting right on the equator like nature's own green beating heart. We're talking about a place where you could lose entire European countries in a single province, where the main river is so deep that if you turned the Eiffel Tower upside down and dropped it in, you'd still have room for a decent-sized apartment building on top. Tonight, we'll unwind together through this extraordinary landscape, from rainforests so vast they generate their own weather systems to mining regions that literally power the device you're watching this on right now. It's a story that spans ancient kingdoms, colonial nightmares, and a resilience that would make a Swiss watch look fragile. Drop a comment and let us know what's brought you to learn about the Congo tonight. Insomnia, genuine curiosity, or just the soothing realization that your daily problems are probably more manageable than governing 2.5 million square kilometers of Central African complexity. Get comfortable, and let's begin our gentle descent into the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Chapter 1. Welcome to the heart of Africa. Sitting pretty in the heart of Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo is not just big, it's spectacularly, ridiculously, almost comically huge. At 2.3 million square kilometers, it's the second largest country in Africa, which is like being the second tallest person in a basketball team of giants. Only Algeria beats it in size. And Algeria cheats by having all that desert space where you could hide the entire state of Montana and nobody would notice. What makes the Congo truly special, though, isn't just its size. It's what sits right in the middle of all that vastness. Picture, if you will, a giant green sponge that's been soaking up rain for millions of years. That's the Congo Basin, and it's home to the world's second largest tropical rainforest. Now, I know what you're thinking. Second largest? What's first? Well, that would be the Amazon, which is basically the Congo's bigger, more famous cousin, who went to South America and became a celebrity. But don't let that fool you. The Congo Basin is like the quiet, mysterious sibling who stays home and turns out to be secretly fascinating. The Congo Basin itself is a geological marvel that would make any geography teacher weep tears of joy. This massive bowl-shaped depression covers approximately 3.7 million square kilometers. That's larger than India, for those keeping track at home. The basin stretches nearly 2,000 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Nile-Congo watershed in the east. It's like nature decided to create the world's largest bathtub, then filled it with trees instead of water. Though, to be fair, there's plenty of water too, as we'll soon discover. Now, here's where things get really interesting. The Congo sits right on the equator, which means it gets the full treatment of equatorial weather. Imagine living in a place where the seasons aren't winter, spring, summer, fall, but rather wet, wetter, slightly less wet, and surprise, even wetter. The equator literally cuts through the country just north of the town of Liranga, creating a climate that's consistently warm, consistently humid, and consistently determined to keep everything as green as possible. The temperature in the Congo Basin rarely varies much from a steady 26 to 28 degrees Celsius. It's like living in the world's largest greenhouse, except instead of tomatoes, you get some of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet. The humidity hovers around 80% most of the time, which means stepping outside feels a bit like being wrapped in a warm, damp towel, one that smells of rich earth and growing things. But the real star of the show, the geographical feature that makes everything else possible, is the Congo River. Oh, what a river this is! At 4,700 kilometers long, it's Africa's second longest river, right after the Nile. But here's where the Congo gets its revenge. While the Nile might be longer, the Congo is deeper, wider, and carries far more water. In fact, it's so deep in places, up to 720 feet, that sunlight has never touched the bottom. That's deeper than many skyscrapers are tall. Swimming in the Congo River isn't just inadvisable because of the crocodiles. It's inadvisable because you might accidentally discover the lost city of Atlantis down there. The Congo River system is like nature's own superhighway network, with tributaries spreading out across the basin like the veins of an enormous leaf. These tributaries have wonderfully evocative names: the Kasai, the Ubangi, the Lomami, each one a major river in its own right. The system is so vast that it drains water from 10 different countries, creating a network of navigable waterways stretching 9,000 kilometers. It's like having your own personal Amazon delivery system, except instead of packages, you get fish, and instead of drones, you get dugout canoes. What's particularly clever about the Congo River system is how it manages to maintain a fairly steady flow year-round. While most rivers have dramatic seasonal changes, the Congo stays relatively consistent because its basin is so enormous that when one area is having its dry season, another area is experiencing its rainy season. It's like having a very large group of friends where someone is always having a birthday, there's always cause for celebration, or in this case, always enough water flowing. The river carries an absolutely staggering amount of water into the Atlantic Ocean, about 41,000 cubic meters per second on average. To put that in perspective, that's enough water to fill an Olympic swimming pool every 2 seconds. During peak flow in the rainy season, it can discharge up to 75,000 cubic meters per second, which is basically the Congo showing off and reminding the Atlantic Ocean who's boss. Now, all this water and warmth creates the perfect conditions for the Congo Basin's crown jewel, its rainforest. This isn't just any forest. This is a 500 million hectares of pure green madness that makes even seasoned ecologists go a bit weak at the knees. The forest is so dense and vast that it actually influences weather patterns across Africa and beyond. It's like having a massive air conditioning unit that also happens to be home to some of the most incredible wildlife on Earth. The forest canopy reaches heights of 130 to 160 feet, creating a green roof so thick that only about 2% of sunlight ever reaches the forest floor. Walking through the Congo rainforest is like entering a natural cathedral where the ceiling is made of leaves, and the air itself seems alive with the sounds of countless creatures going about their daily business. Speaking of creatures, let's talk about the absolutely bonkers level of biodiversity that calls the Congo Basin home. This region contains more than 10,000 species of tropical plants, with 3,000 found nowhere else on Earth. That means if you're a plant and you want to be truly unique, the Congo Basin is apparently where you need to be. It's like the botanical equivalent of moving to a hip neighborhood before it becomes trendy. The animal life is equally spectacular. The Congo Basin hosts more than 400 mammal species, over 1,000 bird species, and more than 900 butterfly species. It's home to forest elephants that are smaller and more mysterious than their savanna cousins, chimpanzees that have figured out how to fish for termites with sticks, basically the first engineers, and bonobos that have built their entire society around the radical concept of solving conflicts through friendship instead of fighting. Honestly, humans could learn a thing or two from bonobos. Then there's the okapi, which looks like someone took a giraffe, a zebra, and a small horse, put them in a blender, and somehow came out with something absolutely adorable. The okapi is so perfectly adapted to forest life that it wasn't even scientifically described until 1901, which is basically yesterday in biological terms. For centuries, It was dismissed as a myth, like a friendly unicorn that actually existed but was just really good at hide and seek. The Congo peacock deserves special mention as the only member of the peacock family native to Africa. It's as if regular peacocks decided they needed a cousin who was better suited to forest living, so they created a more subdued but equally elegant version. The Congo peacock has the distinction of being one of the last large bird species discovered by science, which was quite embarrassing for ornithologists who had to explain how they'd missed a peacock. Mountain gorillas add another layer of majesty to this ecological wonderland. These gentle giants, some weighing up to 400 pounds, live in the mist-covered mountains of eastern Congo. They're incredibly intelligent, with complex social structures and the ability to learn sign language when working with humans. Essentially, they're the strong, silent types of the primate world, except when they're beating their chests, in which case they're the strong, definitely not silent types. The aquatic biodiversity is equally mind-blowing. The Congo River system hosts almost 800 fish species, many of which exist nowhere else on Earth. The river is so isolated in some sections that evolution has essentially been running its own private experiments for millions of years, creating fish that look like they were designed by someone with a very creative imagination and possibly too much time on their hands. One of the most fascinating aspects of Congo's geography is how it creates multiple microclimates within the broader equatorial system. The eastern highlands, where the Rwenzori Mountains rise above 5,000 meters, experience cooler temperatures and almost constant mist. These mountains are often called the Mountains of the Moon, which sounds like something from a fantasy novel but is actually what early Arabic geographers called them because they were so often shrouded in clouds. The southern regions transition into savannas and woodlands, creating a natural buffer zone between the dense rainforest and the drier regions beyond. Here, the landscape opens up into rolling grasslands dotted with trees, providing habitat for different species adapted to more open environments. It's like nature's own zoning system, carefully organizing different types of ecosystems based on rainfall and elevation. Along the Atlantic coast, mangrove swamps create another distinct ecosystem. These salt-tolerant trees grow with their roots in the water, creating nurseries for countless fish species and nesting sites for birds. Mangroves are basically the overachievers of the plant world. They figured out how to live in salt water, prevent coastal erosion, and provide habitat for marine life all at the same time. The Congo's position on the equator also makes it one of only a few places on Earth where you can stand in both the northern and southern hemispheres simply by taking a few steps. This geographical quirk means the Congo experiences the full complexity of equatorial weather patterns, with different regions experiencing wet and dry seasons at different times of the year. It's like having a climate lottery where every region draws different seasonal weather from a very well-mixed hat. Perhaps most remarkably, the Congo Basin sits atop one of the world's largest tropical peatlands. These carbon-rich wetlands, discovered only recently by scientists, store about 30 billion tons of carbon, equivalent to 20 years of United States fossil fuel emissions. It's as if the Earth has been running its own carbon storage facility for thousands of years, quietly keeping all that carbon locked away in the peaty soil beneath the rainforest. The geological history of the region is equally fascinating. The Congo Basin began forming millions of years ago when the African continent started to sag in the middle, creating a massive depression that gradually filled with sediment from surrounding mountains. Over time, this depression became the perfect conditions for tropical rainforest development. It's basically what happens when geography decides to create the ideal conditions for biodiversity and then lets evolution run wild for millions of years. Today, this remarkable geographical region supports over 90 million people while maintaining some of the most important ecosystems on Earth. The Congo Basin influences weather patterns across Africa, and plays a crucial role in global climate regulation. It's a place where geography, climate, and biology come together to create something truly extraordinary. A green heart beating at the center of Africa, pumping life and diversity across an entire continent. From the mist-covered peaks of the Rwenzori Mountains to the swampy deltas where the Congo meets the Atlantic, from the sun-dappled canopy highways used by primates to the mysterious depths of the world's deepest river, the Democratic Republic of Congo is a geographical marvel that continues to surprise and delight scientists, visitors, and anyone lucky enough to experience its wonders. Chapter 2: Ancient Kingdoms and Early Peoples. Picture, if you will, a vast green continent slowly being painted with the brushstrokes of human migration. This isn't happening overnight. We're talking about a process that unfolds over thousands of years, like the world's longest, most consequential game of musical chairs, where instead of chairs, people are looking for the perfect place to call home. Welcome to the story of how the Congo Basin became populated by some of the most interesting, innovative, and occasionally iron-wielding people in human history. Long before European explorers showed up with their maps and questionable opinions about what constituted discovery, the Congo Basin was already home to some remarkable folks. But to understand how they got there, we need to rewind the clock about 5,000 years and talk about one of the greatest migration stories in human history. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a cross-continental road trip. Except, instead of cars, they had feet, and instead of McDonald's rest stops, they had to figure out how to make friends with elephants. The story begins with the Bantu peoples, who started their epic journey somewhere around 3,000 years before the Common Era. The word Bantu simply means people in many of the languages they spoke, which is wonderfully straightforward. These were the ancestors of most of Central Africa's current population, and they were about to embark on one of history's most successful expansion projects, one that would make modern real estate developers weep with envy. The Bantu-speaking peoples originally lived in what is now the Nigeria-Cameroon border region, in an area that archaeologists have romantically dubbed the Bantu homeland. From this starting point, they began spreading out across the continent like the world's most peaceful and agriculturally minded diaspora. Climate change was likely a factor in their migration, not the modern kind with cars and factories, but the natural kind where the Sahara was slowly drying up and pushing people south. The migration happened in two main streams. The eastern stream headed northeast towards the Great Lakes region, while the western stream took a more southerly route through the rainforests toward what would become the Congo Basin. These weren't organized expeditions with maps and supply chains. Instead, picture small groups of extended families gradually moving to new areas over generations, like a very slow-motion wave spreading across the landscape. The western stream is particularly important for our Congo story. These brave souls had to figure out how to make a living in dense tropical rainforest, which is about as different from savanna grassland as underwater basket weaving is from mountain climbing. The rainforest presented unique challenges: thick canopy blocking sunlight, different plants and animals, and soil that behaved differently from what they were used to. It was like moving to an entirely different planet, except the planet had mosquitoes and leopards. The early Bantu migrants reached the Congo Basin around 1,500 years before the Common Era, which means they were settling in while the pyramids of Egypt were still relatively new construction projects. These weren't simple hunter-gatherers. They brought with them knowledge of agriculture, pottery making, and eventually ironworking. They were essentially the technology startups of the ancient world, introducing innovations that would transform the entire region. Speaking of technology, let's talk about iron. The Bantu peoples were among Africa's earliest iron workers. Iron tools were like the smartphones of the ancient world. Once you had them, you wondered how you'd ever lived without them. Iron hoes made farming easier, iron weapons made hunting more successful, and iron tools made clearing forest for agriculture actually possible rather than just theoretically interesting. Archaeological evidence suggests that iron-working technology reached the Congo Basin around the 4th century before the Common Era. But here's where the story gets particularly fascinating. Recent archaeological research has revealed that there wasn't just one wave of Bantu migration into the Congo Basin. Instead, there appears to have been a population collapse around 400 to 600 years of the Common Era, followed by a second wave of migration. This is like discovering that your family history includes not just one big move, but a dramatic departure, a gap, and then a completely separate group of relatives who showed up later with different pottery styles. This population collapse might have been caused by climate change, disease, or simply the challenges of living in one of the world's most demanding environments. When people returned to settle the region again centuries later, they brought new technologies, new pottery styles, and new social organizations. The result was incredible diversity. Today, the Democratic Republic of Congo alone is home to over 200 ethnic groups speaking more than 400 different languages. Before European contact, these communities had developed sophisticated social and political systems. Some groups developed centralized kingdoms with powerful rulers and complex administrative structures. Others preferred more decentralized systems where power was shared among councils of elders, age groups, or clan leaders. It was like having different experiments in governance happening simultaneously across the region. Age was incredibly important in most of these societies. Elders weren't just respected, they were the repositories of knowledge, the arbiters of disputes, and the keepers of cultural traditions. Some historians have called certain African societies democracies of age, where your voice in important decisions grew stronger as you accumulated years and wisdom. It was a system that made getting older something to look forward to rather than dread. Many Congo Basin societies developed sophisticated economic systems long before European contact. They had complex trade networks, specialized crafts, and systems of tribute and redistribution that kept goods flowing across vast distances. Some communities became renowned for their ironworking, others for their pottery, and still others for their skill in hunting or fishing. It was like having an entire economy based on everyone being really good at their chosen specialty. Trade was the lifeblood of many early Congo societies. The region was blessed with abundant natural resources: copper, iron ore, ivory, exotic animals, medicinal plants, and various agricultural products. Early trade networks connected the Congo Basin to the outside world long before European arrival. Copper from the Katanga region was traded as far as the East African coast. Ivory was prized throughout the known world. The spiritual life of these early societies was equally complex. Most groups developed rich mythologies that explained their origins, their relationship to the natural world, and their place in the cosmic order. Ancestor worship was common. The idea that deceased family members continued to play active roles in the lives of their descendants. Religious specialists, shamans, diviners, healers, weren't just spiritual leaders, they were psychologists, medical doctors, and conflict resolution specialists, all wrapped up in one. Around the 14th century, something remarkable happened. From the complex mosaic of small communities and chiefdoms in the Congo region, a truly great kingdom emerged. This was the Kingdom of Congo, and it would become one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in all of Africa. The kingdom's rise is a perfect example of how the right combination of geography, leadership, and historical timing can create something extraordinary. The Kingdom of Congo emerged through what historians love, a combination of politics, romance, and strategic alliance building. Around 1390, according to traditional accounts, A ruler named Lukeni Luanimi founded the kingdom, but the real story probably begins earlier, with political marriages between rulers of smaller kingdoms. Nimi and Nzinga, ruler of Vungu and Mpemba, forged an alliance through marriage with Nsaku Lao of neighbouring Mbata. This was medieval realpolitik at its finest. The Kingdom of Congo was centred around its capital, Mbanza Congo, which later became known as São Salvador. This wasn't just a big village. This was a genuine urban centre, with a population that probably reached 50,000 at its peak. For medieval Central Africa, this was basically Manhattan. The city was laid out in neighbourhoods, had markets, administrative buildings, and workshops for various crafts. The political structure was sophisticated enough to impress Portuguese officials when they first encountered it in the 1480s. At the top was the Manikongo, the King of Congo, who ruled with the assistance of a council of nobles and appointed officials. The kingdom was divided into provinces, each governed by a provincial governor appointed by the king, but who also had to maintain the loyalty of local chiefs and nobles. The Manikongo wasn't just a political ruler, he was also a spiritual figure, believed to have special connections to the ancestors and the divine. Royal ceremonies were elaborate affairs that reinforced the king's authority, while serving as grand social events. The king was distinguished by special regalia, ceremonial headdresses, royal stools, drums, and jewellery made from ivory and copper. It was pageantry with a purpose. The kingdom's economy was based on agriculture, trade, and tribute collection. Each province contributed tribute to the royal treasury in the form of agricultural products, craft goods, and sometimes people for the king's service. This was more like a social contract where provinces provided support to the central government in exchange for military protection, legal arbitration, and access to trade networks. The Kingdom of Congo developed extensive trade networks connecting the interior regions with the Atlantic coast. They traded copper, iron, ivory, raffia textiles, and agricultural products. The kingdom's artisans were renowned for their skill in metalworking, textile production, and pottery. Congo cloth made from raffia palm fibres was so finely woven that European visitors compared it favourably to silk. African textiles so beautiful that Europeans had to admit they were pretty impressive. The social structure was hierarchical but not rigid. At the top were the royal family and nobility, followed by various classes of free citizens, and at the bottom were slaves, though slavery in traditional African societies was quite different from the plantation slavery that would later develop in the Americas. Social mobility was possible through military service, successful trading, or exceptional skill in crafts or administration. What made the Kingdom of Congo particularly impressive was its legal and administrative system. The kingdom had formal courts, established legal procedures, and a bureaucracy that could manage the affairs of a territory covering hundreds of thousands of square kilometres. Disputes were resolved through established legal processes, contracts were enforced, and records were kept of important transactions. This was government that actually functioned. The kingdom's military organisation was equally sophisticated. The Manikongo commanded a standing army that could be supplemented by provincial forces when needed. Military units were organised by region and specialty, with some groups specialising in particular weapons or tactics. The army wasn't just for defence, it was also a tool of expansion and a way for young men to gain status and wealth. Religious and cultural life in the Kingdom of Congo was rich and complex. Traditional beliefs centered around ancestor worship, nature spirits, and a supreme deity. Religious specialists performed ceremonies for healing, divination, and communication with the spiritual world. Art and music were integral parts of religious and social life, with elaborate masks, sculptures, and musical performances marking important occasions. By the time Portuguese explorers arrived in the late 15th century, the Kingdom of Congo was at its height. It controlled territory from the Atlantic coast inland to the Congo River, and from the Congo River in the north to the Kwanza River in the south. The population probably exceeded 2 million people, making it one of the largest political entities in sub-Saharan Africa at the time. The Portuguese were genuinely impressed by what they found. Here was a sophisticated African kingdom with urban centres, complex government, extensive trade networks, and advanced craftsmanship. It challenged European stereotypes about African capabilities and forced them to approach the kingdom as a legitimate political entity, rather than simply a source of raw materials and slaves. The early relationship between Portugal and the Kingdom of Congo was based on mutual respect and benefit. The Portuguese provided new technologies, luxury goods, and military assistance, while the Congo offered trade opportunities, political alliance, and eventually conversion to Christianity. It was, for a brief historical moment, a relationship between equals. Before European contact changed everything, the Kingdom of Congo represented the culmination of thousands of years of African innovation, migration, and political development. It stood as proof that the Congo Basin wasn't an empty wilderness waiting for outside development, but rather the home of sophisticated societies that had been building complex civilizations for millennia. From the first Bantu migrants who figured out how to thrive in the rainforest, to the iron workers who revolutionized agriculture and warfare, to the political innovators who built the Kingdom of Congo, the pre-colonial Congo was home to some of humanity's most remarkable achievements. These weren't primitive societies waiting for enlightenment from elsewhere. They were vibrant, sophisticated, and successful civilizations that had mastered one of the world's most challenging environments and built something magnificent in the heart of Africa. Chapter 3: The Colonial Nightmare. Now we come to one of the darkest chapters in human history, a story so appalling that it makes medieval torture chambers look like wellness spas. We're about to discuss the transformation of the sophisticated Kingdom of Congo into what can only be described as a continental-sized concentration camp, courtesy of one man's greed and an entire colonial system's willingness to look the other way while unspeakable horrors unfolded in the heart of Africa. To understand how we got from the thriving kingdom we discussed previously to one of history's greatest atrocities, we need to meet our villain, King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold was a man with big dreams and a small country. Belgium was roughly the size of a decent-sized American state, and Leopold looked around at his European neighbours with their vast colonial empires and felt rather left out of the party. It's like being the only person in your friend group who doesn't own a yacht, except in this case the yacht was an entire continent. Leopold had been lobbying for Belgium to acquire a colony since the 1860s. He even gave his finance minister a paperweight inscribed with "Belgium needs a colony," which is either dedication to your political agenda or an early example of passive-aggressive office gifts. But the Belgian government refused to fund colonial adventures, so Leopold decided to go it alone, which is where our story takes a turn toward the absolutely horrifying. Enter Henry Morton Stanley, the famous explorer who had recently found Dr. Livingstone. Stanley had just completed his epic journey across Africa, following the Congo River from source to sea, and Leopold saw an opportunity. He hired Stanley to establish trading posts along the Congo River, ostensibly for humanitarian and scientific purposes. In reality, Leopold was laying the groundwork for the largest private business venture in history, one that would make modern corporate greed look positively quaint. Through international conferences and diplomatic maneuvers, Leopold managed to convince European powers to grant him personal control over a vast Central African territory. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, Leopold presented himself as a humanitarian, concerned with ending slavery and promoting free trade. The result was the creation of the Congo Free State in 1885, a territory 76 times larger than Belgium, placed under Leopold's personal rule. The name Congo Free State was one of history's great ironies, like calling a prisoner Liberty Lodge. There was nothing free about it except Leopold's freedom to exploit every resource and person within its borders for personal profit. This wasn't even a Belgian colony. It was Leopold's private property, run from his Brussels palace as his personal business venture. Imagine owning all of Texas and running it as your private company. For the first few years, the Congo Free State was unprofitable. The territory was vast, largely unmapped, and inhabited by people who had their own ideas about land use. Leopold was spending enormous sums building infrastructure and maintaining a private army called the Force Publique. While income from ivory barely covered expenses, he was running the world's largest money-losing operation. Then, in the 1890s, everything changed. The rubber boom, John Boyd Dunlop's invention of the inflatable tire, combined with growing automobile popularity, created enormous global demand for rubber. The Congo Basin was full of wild rubber vines. Suddenly, Leopold's unprofitable territory became potentially the most valuable real estate on Earth. Unfortunately for Congo's people, Leopold approached rubber extraction with all the humanitarian sensitivity of a medieval warlord. The system Leopold established was breathtakingly simple in its cruelty. The territory was divided between Leopold's personal domain and concessions granted to private companies. Each village was assigned a rubber quota that had to be delivered regularly to government posts. The quotas were deliberately set impossibly high, requiring virtually every able-bodied person to spend most of their time collecting rubber. This wasn't employment. It was forced labour on an industrial scale, imposed at gunpoint. The Force Publique deserves special mention as one of history's more horrifying military organisations. This was Leopold's private army, consisting of European officers commanding African soldiers who had been kidnapped, purchased from slave traders, or pressed into service after village destruction. These soldiers were trained to enforce rubber quotas through terror, using methods so barbaric they shocked even other colonial administrators. The most infamous aspect of Force Publique operations was their ammunition policy. To prevent soldiers from wasting bullets on hunting, officers required that for every bullet fired, soldiers had to produce a severed human hand as proof the bullet had killed someone resisting rubber quotas. This created a grotesque economy of severed hands, with soldiers collecting them as efficiency proof and villages sometimes cutting off hands of the living when they couldn't meet rubber quotas. Villages that failed to meet quotas faced systematic punishment, including rape, murder, and community destruction. Women and children were taken hostage to force men into forest work. Those who resisted were shot, their hands cut off as trophies. Some soldiers found it easier to cut off hands of living people, children, women, anyone they could catch, rather than hunt down actual resistors. The rubber collection process itself was nightmarish. Congo's rubber came from wild vines scattered throughout rainforest, not cultivated trees like in Brazil. Workers ventured deep into jungle, sliced open vines, and collected latex. They often covered their bodies with latex, then scraped it off, frequently taking skin and hair. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and yielded little rubber per person, meaning ever more people had to be pressed into service. The human cost was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest 10 to 15 million people died during Leopold's rule, roughly half Congo's population. Some estimates reach 20 million. This was one of history's largest genocides, carried out not for racial or religious reasons, but simply for profit. Leopold's rubber empire killed more people than the Armenian genocide or Holocaust, funding construction projects in Belgium and maintaining his lavish lifestyle. Deaths came from multiple sources: outright murder by force publique, starvation as communities couldn't farm because everyone collected rubber, disease spreading through weakened populations, and breakdown of traditional social structures. Entire regions were depopulated, villages were abandoned, family structures collapsed under forced labor and systematic terror. What makes this more appalling is how long Leopold kept it hidden. The Congo Free State had extremely limited outside communication, and Leopold controlled all territory access. Visitors were carefully managed, shown only what Leopold wanted, and prevented from free travel. For years, Leopold successfully presented himself as a humanitarian monarch, bringing civilization to darkest Africa, while operating history's most brutal forced labor system. Truth began emerging in the 1900s through missionaries, traders, and government officials who witnessed atrocities firsthand. George Washington Williams, an African-American journalist, was among the first to expose Leopold's reality. After visiting Congo in 1890, he wrote an open letter describing crimes against humanity, one of the first uses of that phrase in its modern sense. The most famous account came from British consul Roger Casement, who conducted an official investigation for the British government. His report, published in 1904, provided detailed atrocity documentation and sparked international outrage. Casement interviewed hundreds of witnesses and documented systematic abuse patterns that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. British shipping clerk Edmund Dene Morel conducted his own investigation. Morel noticed ships leaving Europe loaded with guns and ammunition but returning carrying rubber and ivory. Where were the trade goods for purchasing these valuable commodities? The answer: there were none. Rubber and ivory were extracted through forced labor, not legitimate commerce. Morel launched the world's first international human rights campaign, the Congo Reform Association. He published pamphlets, organized lectures, and coordinated with activists to expose Leopold's crimes. The campaign attracted support from major literary figures, including Mark Twain, who wrote King Leopold's Soliloquy, portraying the king defending his actions. Arthur Conan Doyle also joined, writing The Crime of the Congo. Perhaps the most haunting literary response came from Joseph Conrad, who had worked as a steamboat captain on the Congo River during Leopold's early rule. His novella, Heart of Darkness, published in 1899, captured the psychological horror of the colonial system, though Conrad focused more on effects on European colonizers than Congolese suffering. Under mounting international pressure, the Belgian government was finally forced to act. In 1908, Belgium annexed the Congo Free State, ending Leopold's personal rule and establishing the Belgian Congo as an official colony. Leopold was compensated handsomely for his territory. Just before transferring control, Leopold ordered destruction of most Congo Free State archives, ensuring the full extent of his crimes would never be documented. The end of Congo Free State didn't mean end of colonial oppression, just management change. The Belgian Congo, while less overtly brutal than Leopold's regime, remained a colonial system designed to extract Central African wealth for European benefit. Belgians adopted a paternalistic approach to colonial rule, which sounds benevolent but was actually condescending, viewing Congolese people as children needing Belgian parental guidance. Under Belgian rule, the worst Leopold-era excesses were eliminated, but fundamental colonial exploitation structures remained unchanged. Belgians invested heavily in infrastructure: roads, railways, schools, hospitals, but these investments primarily facilitated resource extraction and maintained colonial control, not benefiting Congolese people. Mining became the dominant industry, with Belgian companies extracting copper, diamonds, gold, and uranium while providing minimal local benefits. Belgian colonial system was built on racial segregation and systematic exclusion of Congolese people from meaningful participation in their country's governance or economy. Africans were barred from most skilled occupations, excluded from higher education, and prevented from owning businesses or urban property. Colonial government created a small évolué class, Congolese people who adopted European customs and education, but even they were treated as second-class citizens. What made Belgian rule particularly frustrating was its combination of paternalistic rhetoric and systematic oppression. Belgians constantly spoke of their civilizing mission and development efforts, while simultaneously preventing Congolese people from accessing education, training, and opportunities for equal participation. It was like being told you're being helped by people who won't let you learn to help yourself. Independence movement seeds began growing in the 1950s as educated Congolese organized and demanded political rights. The process was sparked partly by developments elsewhere in Africa. Ghana had gained independence in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah, but Belgian authorities were caught off guard by rapid Congolese nationalism growth. Having convinced themselves their paternalistic system created grateful subjects rather than frustrated citizens. The key figure was Patrice Lumumba, a former postal clerk and beer salesman who became one of Africa's most compelling political leaders. Lumumba differed from other African independence leaders by explicitly rejecting tribalism and regionalism for unified Congolese national identity. His Mouvement National Congolais was the first political party advocating immediate independence and appealing to Congolese people across ethnic and regional lines. The turning point came January 4th, 1959, when riots erupted in Leopoldville after colonial authorities banned a political meeting. Belgian response was swift and brutal. Dozens of Congolese protesters were killed. But instead of intimidating the independence movement, violence galvanized Congolese opposition and convinced even moderate leaders that gradual reform was insufficient. Faced with growing unrest and international pressure, the Belgian government convened a roundtable conference in Brussels in January 1960. Belgians hoped for gradual transition over decades, but Congolese delegates, led by recently released Lumumba, demanded immediate independence. Under pressure, Belgians agreed to grant independence on June 30th, 1960, just 6 months later. The rush to independence was disastrous. 6 months was barely enough time to organize elections, let alone prepare a vast, underdeveloped territory for self-government. Belgians had deliberately prevented Congolese people from gaining administrative experience, so there were almost no trained civil servants, military officers, or technical specialists. At independence, the entire Congo had fewer than 30 university graduates among 13 million people. Independence Day, June 30th, 1960, was both triumph and new nightmare beginning. The Leopoldville ceremony was attended by King Baudouin of Belgium, Leopold II's great-grandson. Baudouin gave a breathtakingly tone-deaf speech, praising his ancestor and presenting colonialism as Belgium's generous gift to Congolese people. Then Lumumba, unscheduled, took the podium and delivered one of history's most powerful anti-colonial speeches. In front of the Belgian king, he denounced 80 years of colonial brutality. We have known ironies, insults and blows, which we had to undergo morning, noon, and night because we were blacks. His speech electrified Congolese listeners and horrified Belgian officials. Within days, the new nation descended into chaos. The army mutinied against Belgian officers. Violence erupted between ethnic groups, and mineral-rich Katanga province declared independence with Belgian support. Lumumba, facing national collapse, requested UN help and eventually Soviet assistance when Western powers refused aid. This Cold War alignment would ultimately cost him his life. From the magnificent Kingdom of Congo to Congo Free State horrors, to Belgian Congo paternalistic oppression to chaotic 1960 independence, colonial Congo's story testifies to human greed, cruelty, and capacity for both resistance and survival. The colonial period didn't just extract wealth from Central Africa, it systematically destroyed traditional institutions, disrupted social structures, and created conditions for decades of future conflict. Chapter 4: Independence and Chaos. If you thought the colonial period was bad, buckle up, because we're about to dive into what happens when a newly independent nation tries to function with fewer than 30 university graduates, an army that's mutinying, and superpowers treating your country like a chessboard. Welcome to the Congo crisis, where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, often simultaneously, and usually with devastating consequences for millions of ordinary people who just wanted to live their lives in peace. We left our story with Patrice Lumumba delivering his electrifying independence speech on June 30th, 1960, essentially telling assembled Belgian dignitaries exactly what he thought of 80 years of colonial brutality. Within days, the fragile new nation began unraveling faster than a cheap sweater. It's like watching a disaster movie where every possible catastrophe happens at once, except this was real life and there was no Hollywood ending waiting around the corner. The first crisis erupted just 5 days after independence, when the Congolese army mutinied against their Belgian officers. The Force Publique had been renamed the Armée Nationale Congolaise, but that was basically just putting new uniforms on the same problematic organization. The army was still commanded entirely by Belgian officers, who had made it clear they expected nothing to change despite independence. When one Belgian general famously wrote, "Before independence equals after independence" on a blackboard, he was being spectacularly tone-deaf. Congolese soldiers had expected independence to mean promotions, better pay, and recognition of their service. Instead, they got the same Belgian officers telling them nothing would change. This went about as well as you'd expect. Soldiers began mutinying across the country, and what started as military protest quickly spiraled into broader violence between Congolese and Belgian civilians. It was like a powder keg that had been building pressure for decades finally exploding. Belgium's response was to send paratroopers to protect Belgian civilians, which was reasonable in theory but catastrophic in practice. To the Congolese, this looked exactly like an attempt to re-establish colonial control under the guise of protecting European lives. Lumumba was furious and demanded Belgian troops withdraw immediately. The Belgians refused, leading to the first major diplomatic crisis of Congo's independence, and it was barely a week old. Then things got worse. On July 11th, 1960, the mineral-rich province of Katanga declared independence from Congo under Moise Tshombe. This wasn't just any province seceding. Katanga produced most of Congo's export earnings and government revenue. It was like California deciding to leave the United States, except imagine California controlled about 70% of federal tax revenue. Without Katanga, Congo was essentially bankrupt before it had figured out how to govern itself. Tshombe's secession wasn't a grassroots independence movement. It was backed and bankrolled by Belgian mining companies who preferred dealing with compliant Tshombe rather than unpredictable Lumumba. Belgian troops conveniently landed in Katanga to protect Belgian nationals, but somehow they seemed much more interested in protecting mining installations than actual people. The whole operation had the subtlety of a brick through a window, but it was effective. Faced with his country falling apart and Belgian troops on Congolese soil, Lumumba did what any reasonable leader would do. He appealed to the United Nations for help. The UN Security Council quickly authorized a peacekeeping force to restore order and get Belgian troops out of Congo. It seemed like exactly the situation the United Nations had been created to handle. Unfortunately, nobody gave the UN peacekeepers a clear mandate about what they were actually supposed to do once they arrived. The UN force, led by Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld, took a strictly neutral position. They would keep peace between different factions, but wouldn't take sides or help the central government fight secessionists. This was profoundly frustrating for Lumumba, who reasonably pointed out that Katanga's secession was being supported by foreign troops and that the UN should help the legitimate government restore territorial integrity. The UN's response was essentially, "not our problem," which was both technically correct and practically useless. With the UN refusing to help restore Katanga and Western powers clearly supporting secessionists, Lumumba made the decision that would ultimately cost him his life. He turned to the Soviet Union for assistance. From Lumumba's perspective, this was logical. The Soviets were the only major power willing to provide military support to help him keep his country together. From the perspective of Western intelligence agencies in the middle of the Cold War, this was confirmation of their worst fears. The truth was more mundane. Lumumba wasn't a communist. He was a nationalist who wanted to keep his country unified and control its own resources. But in the paranoid atmosphere of 1960, accepting Soviet help was like painting a target on your back. The CIA had already decided Lumumba was too dangerous to live, and his appeal to Moscow just provided additional justification for what they were already planning. The arrival of Soviet advisors and military equipment split the Congolese government. President Kasavubu, who had always favored a more federal system and was more amenable to Western interests, was horrified by Lumumba's Soviet connections. The two leaders, who had never really gotten along, were now openly at odds about their country's fundamental direction. It was a constitutional crisis waiting to happen. Enter Joseph Désiré Mobutu, a young army colonel who had been one of Lumumba's closest associates. Mobutu was Lumumba's former secretary, protégé, and trusted friend. He was also, unbeknownst to Lumumba, secretly in contact with the CIA station chief in Leopoldville. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who smile at you every day and call you friend. On September 5th, 1960, President Kasavubu announced on national radio that he was dismissing Prime Minister Lumumba, using massacres in South Kasai as a pretext. Lumumba immediately responded by announcing that he was dismissing Kasavubu. For several surreal days, Congo had two rival governments, each claiming legitimacy and each ordering the other to step down. It was like a political version of the "I'm not touching you" game, except with nuclear superpowers picking sides. The Congolese parliament supported Lumumba, which should have resolved the crisis in his favour. But parliamentary votes don't matter much when the army has other ideas. On September 14th, 1960, Colonel Mobutu launched a coup, claiming to resolve the deadlock by temporarily taking power himself. He announced that he was suspending both president and prime minister and installing a college of commissioners general, university graduates who would run the country until the political crisis was resolved. Mobutu's coup was bloodless, efficient, and almost certainly coordinated with the CIA. Within days of taking power, he expelled all Soviet advisors and moved to neutralize Lumumba, who was placed under house arrest. The UN peacekeepers, who had steadfastly refused to help Lumumba fight secessionists, somehow found themselves perfectly positioned to help maintain Mobutu's house arrest of the legitimate prime minister. Funny how neutrality works sometimes. Lumumba wasn't the type to accept house arrest quietly. On November 27th, 1960, he escaped from his residence and began making his way towards Stanleyville, where his political supporters controlled the regional government. His plan was to establish a rival government and rally opposition to Mobutu's coup. It was a desperate gamble, but it might have worked if he had managed to reach his destination. he didn't make it. On December 1st, 1960, Mobutu's forces captured Lumumba near Port Francois. The images of his capture are heartbreaking. The former prime minister bound and humiliated, being paraded before his captors like a trophy. The man who had electrified the world with his independence speech just 5 months earlier was now a prisoner of his former protégé. What happened next was one of the most shameful episodes in Cold War history. Despite international appeals for his safety and UN demands that he be treated according to due process, Lumumba was secretly transferred to Katanga province on January 17, 1961. This was effectively a death sentence. Everyone involved knew exactly what would happen to Lumumba there. That same day, Patrice Lumumba was tortured and executed by Katangan forces, along with 2 of his closest associates. Belgian officers were present at the execution, and the CIA had been fully informed of the transfer plans. Western intelligence agencies didn't pull the trigger, but they created the conditions that made Lumumba's murder inevitable, and chose not to intervene when they could have saved his life. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba wasn't just the murder of one man, it was the death of Congo's democratic experiment and the beginning of 37 years of dictatorship. With Lumumba gone, Mobutu gradually consolidated control over the country, eventually dispensing with the pretense of temporary rule and establishing himself as Congo's permanent dictator. In November 1965, Mobutu launched a second coup, this time openly seizing power for himself. He justified the takeover by pointing to chaos and instability that had plagued Congo since independence, conveniently ignoring his own role in creating that chaos. He promised to restore order and unity, to end the destructive influence of politicians, and to govern in the true interests of the Congolese people. Mobutu moved quickly to consolidate authority. He suspended parliament, banned all political parties, except his own, popular movement of the revolution, and began implementing what he called an authenticity campaign designed to purge Congo of colonial influences and restore African values. It was brilliant political theatre that disguised the establishment of one of Africa's most repressive dictatorships. In 1971, Mobutu renamed the country Zaire, claiming to restore its authentic African identity. Cities were given new names. Leopoldville became Kinshasa, Stanleyville became Kisangani, and Elizabethville became Lubumbashi. Even the Congo River was renamed the Zaire River. Mobutu himself adopted a new name, Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngbendu Waza Banga, which roughly translates to the all-powerful warrior who goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. The authenticity campaign was more than just changing names. Mobutu banned European dress, requiring Congolese men to wear traditional African clothing. He outlawed European names, forcing citizens to adopt African names. He even banned Christmas, replacing it with celebrations of African culture. It was cultural nationalism taken to absurd extremes, but it served an important political purpose by making opposition to Mobutu seem like opposition to authentic African culture. Behind the rhetoric of African authenticity, Mobutu was building a kleptocracy of stunning proportions. The word kleptocracy, rule by thieves, was actually popularized to describe Mobutu's system of government. He systematically looted Zaire's vast natural resources, using the country's wealth to fund his personal lifestyle while the population sank into poverty. By some estimates, Mobutu stole more than $5 billion from Zaire's treasury during his rule. Mobutu's personal extravagances became legendary. He built a palace complex in his hometown of Gabadalite that was dubbed the Versailles of the Jungle, complete with multiple palaces, luxury hotels, and an airport capable of handling Concorde supersonic jets. He regularly chartered Concordes for shopping trips to Paris, spending more on a single flight than most Congolese saw in their lifetimes. The key to Mobutu's survival was his alliance with Western powers, particularly the United States. During the Cold War, Mobutu positioned himself as a reliable anti-communist ally in the heart of Africa. He allowed the CIA to use Zaire as a base for operations in neighboring countries. In return, the United States provided financial and military support that kept Mobutu in power despite his obvious failures as a leader. Mobutu's system of control was as sophisticated as it was ruthless. He rotated government positions constantly, ensuring that no one could build an independent power base. Between 1965 and 1997, he reshuffled his cabinet 60 times. Ministers never knew if they would still have their jobs next month, which encouraged them to steal as much as possible while they were in office. The economic consequences of Mobutu's kleptocracy were catastrophic. Zaire had some of the world's richest mineral deposits: copper, cobalt, diamonds, gold, uranium, but the population became increasingly impoverished as national wealth flowed into private Swiss bank accounts. Infrastructure collapsed, education systems failed, and healthcare became virtually non-existent outside the capital. The end of the Cold War in the early 1990s spelled the beginning of the end for Mobutu. With the Soviet Union gone, the United States no longer needed a reliable anti-communist ally in Central Africa. Western support began to dry up, just as domestic opposition was growing stronger. Students, workers, and even some military units began openly challenging Mobutu's authority. The final blow came from an unexpected direction. The Rwandan genocide in 1994 created massive refugee flows across Zaire's eastern border. Among the refugees were many of the perpetrators of the genocide, who used refugee camps as bases to continue attacking Rwanda. When the new Rwandan government decided to eliminate this threat, they found a convenient ally in Laurent Désiré Kabila, a long-time Congolese rebel leader. In October 1996, a coalition of Rwandan troops, Ugandan forces, and Congolese rebels began advancing across eastern Zaire. Mobutu's army, demoralized by years of non-payment and corruption, offered little resistance. Town after town fell to the rebels as soldiers either fled or joined the advancing coalition. After 32 years of absolute power, Mobutu's regime collapsed in just 7 months. On May 16, 1997, Mobutu fled Kinshasa as rebel forces approached the capital. The man who had once seemed invincible left behind a country in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, institutions corrupted, and society traumatized by decades of misrule. He died in exile in Morocco just 3 months later, his vast personal fortune intact, while the country he had ruled for over 3 decades faced an uncertain future. Chapter 5: Wars and Warlords. If you thought replacing one dictator would magically solve Congo's problems, you were about to be disappointed on a scale that would make optimists everywhere weep. What followed Mobutu's fall was 9 years of warfare so complex and devastating that it earned the grim nickname Africa's World War. We're about to explore how Laurent Désiré Kabila's victory celebration lasted exactly 1 year before his own former allies turned their guns on him, plunging Central Africa into a conflict that would claim more lives than any war since the 1940s. Laurent Désiré Kabila entered Kinshasa on May 17, 1997, as a liberating hero. He renamed Zaire back to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, suspended the constitution, and promised elections within 2 years. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Congo might finally have found a leader capable of bringing stability and progress. That hope lasted approximately 12 months before everything went spectacularly wrong again. The problem was that Kabila's victory had never really been his own. The The Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo had been created, funded, and directed by Rwanda and Uganda, with Kabila serving essentially as the Congolese face on a foreign operation. Rwandan officers held key positions in the new Congolese army, with Rwanda's James Kabarebe actually serving as head of Congo's armed forces. It was like installing a puppet government, except the puppet occasionally forgot he was supposed to dance to someone else's tune. Rwanda and Uganda hadn't helped overthrow Mobutu out of altruism. They wanted control over Congo's eastern provinces, both for security reasons and to access the region's extraordinary mineral wealth. The official justification was that Hutu militias responsible for the Rwandan genocide were still operating from Congolese territory and posed a threat to Rwanda's Tutsi population. The unofficial reality was that Rwanda and Uganda had discovered that controlling Congolese mining areas was extremely profitable. The relationship began souring almost immediately. Many Congolese were deeply resentful of the conspicuous foreign presence in their capital and government. They hadn't fought to replace Belgian colonizers and Mobutu's dictatorship, only to find themselves ruled by Rwandan officers. Kabila, reading the political winds, began distancing himself from his former allies and making increasingly pointed references to foreign occupation. The breaking point came in July 1998, when Kabila ordered all foreign troops to leave Congolese soil immediately. From his perspective, this was both politically necessary and perfectly reasonable. What sovereign government wants foreign armies stationed permanently on its territory? From Rwanda and Uganda's perspective, this was an ungrateful puppet trying to cut his strings. They had invested heavily in putting Kabila in power, and weren't about to let him kick them out just when the mining concessions were becoming profitable. On August 2nd, 1998, exactly 1 year and 10 weeks after Kabila's triumphant arrival in Kinshasa, Rwanda and Uganda invaded Congo again. This time, they were supporting two new rebel groups: the Rally for Congolese Democracy, backed primarily by Rwanda, and the Movement for the Liberation of Congo, supported by Uganda. The Second Congo War had begun, and it would make the First Congo War look like a minor skirmish. The scale of this conflict was unprecedented in African history. 9 countries eventually became directly involved, along with dozens of armed groups, militias, and proxy forces. Rwanda and Uganda invaded from the east, while Zimbabwe, Angola, and Namibia sent troops to support Kabila's government. Chad and the Central African Republic provided indirect support. It was as if the entire central and eastern regions of Africa had decided to fight a war in Congo's backyard. The war's complexity was staggering. Unlike traditional conflicts with clear sides and objectives, the Second Congo War featured constantly shifting alliances, multiple overlapping conflicts, and participants with completely different goals. Some were fighting for political control, others for ethnic dominance, still others for access to mineral resources. Some groups were fighting the government, some were fighting each other, and some were fighting anyone who got in their way. The human cost was catastrophic beyond description. The International Rescue Committee eventually estimated that 5.4 million people died between 1998 and 2007 as a result of the conflict. To put that in perspective, that's more than the population of entire countries like Norway or Ireland simply vanishing. Most deaths weren't from bullets or bombs, but from disease, malnutrition, and the collapse of basic healthcare systems as the country descended into chaos. What made the Second Congo War particularly devastating was how it combined political conflict with ethnic violence and economic exploitation. In the eastern provinces, local militias formed along ethnic lines, settling old grievances while fighting for control of mining areas. Civilians weren't just caught in the crossfire. They were specifically targeted, terrorized, and displaced as military strategy. The war became a feeding frenzy for Congo's mineral wealth. UN investigators documented systematic looting by all sides, with military commanders treating mining areas as personal ATMs. Rwandan and Ugandan officers established elaborate smuggling networks to export diamonds, gold, coltan, and other valuable minerals. Even countries officially supporting the government, like Zimbabwe, were accused of stripping mining assets as payment for their military support. Women and children bore the worst of the violence. Rape became so widespread and systematic that it was clearly being used as a weapon of war, designed to terrorize communities and destroy social bonds. Hundreds of thousands of children were forced into armed groups as soldiers, porters, and sexual slaves. Entire communities were displaced repeatedly, creating massive refugee populations that strained neighboring countries' resources. The international response was tragically inadequate. The United Nations Security Council passed resolution after resolution condemning the violence, but UN peacekeepers were nowhere near sufficient to patrol a country the size of Western Europe torn apart by multiple armies. The international community seemed paralyzed by the conflict's complexity, unable to identify clear good guys and bad guys, or develop coherent strategies for intervention. Laurent Désiré Kabila proved to be an increasingly erratic and authoritarian leader as the war progressed. He banned political parties, restricted press freedom, and relied heavily on foreign mercenaries and child soldiers to maintain power. His supporters portrayed him as a nationalist hero standing up to foreign aggression, while his critics saw him as another African strongman whose policies were making an already terrible situation worse. The conflict took a dramatic turn on January 16, 2001, when Kabila was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards during a meeting at the presidential palace. The exact circumstances remain disputed, but the assassination was apparently part of a wider conspiracy involving several of his close associates. It was a chaotic, violent end to a chaotic, violent presidency. What happened next surprised everyone, including probably the assassins themselves. Instead of collapsing into even greater chaos, Congo's government managed an orderly succession. Laurent Désiré Kabila's 29-year-old son, Joseph Kabila, was quickly installed as president. The transition was so smooth that many observers suspected it had been planned in advance, though Joseph Kabila insisted he had known nothing about his father's assassination. Joseph Kabila was everything his father wasn't: young, educated, multilingual, and diplomatic. Where Laurent had been confrontational and erratic, Joseph was measured and pragmatic. He spoke fluent English and French, had received military training in China, and understood that Congo's survival depended on ending the war rather than winning it. The contrast was so stark that some cynics wondered if the assassination had been arranged specifically to bring the more manageable son to power. The younger Kabila immediately began reaching out to regional leaders and international mediators, signaling his willingness to negotiate. Unlike his father, who had treated peace talks as opportunities to buy time for military preparations, Joseph Kabila seemed genuinely committed to finding a political solution. This shift in leadership style created the first real opportunity for peace since the war began. The key breakthrough came with the Lusaka ceasefire agreement, which had been signed in 1999 but never implemented under Laurent Désiré Kabila's leadership. Joseph Kabila embraced the peace process, agreeing to power-sharing arrangements that would bring former rebel leaders into the government. It was a pragmatic acknowledgement that military victory was impossible and that peace required compromise with Congo's enemies. In December 2002, the various Congolese factions signed the Global and All-Inclusive Agreement, which established a transitional government bringing together the national government, main rebel groups, political opposition, and civil society representatives. Joseph Kabila remained president, but 4 vice presidents were appointed, representing different factions. It was an unwieldy arrangement, but it created a framework for ending the fighting. The formal end of the Second Congo War was declared on July 18, 2003. With the establishment of the transitional government, Rwanda and Uganda began withdrawing their troops, though they maintained influence through proxy forces. The massive international peacekeeping force that had never materialized during the worst fighting finally arrived, though by then the country was already stabilizing. The peace didn't mean the violence ended everywhere. Eastern Congo remained plagued by armed groups, some connected to the former warring parties and others operating independently, but the existential threat to Congo's survival as a state had passed. The transitional government, despite its many flaws and internal tensions, managed to hold the country together and prepare for the first democratic elections since independence. The elections held in 2006 were a remarkable achievement for a country that had been written off as a failed state just a few years earlier. Over 25 million Congolese registered to vote, and despite some irregularities and violence, the process was generally considered credible. Joseph Kabila won the presidency in a runoff election against Jean-Pierre Bemba, a former rebel leader who had become his main political rival. The human cost of the Congo Wars was almost impossible to comprehend. Beyond the millions who died, tens of millions more were displaced, traumatized, or impoverished. Entire generations grew up knowing only war, displacement, and survival. Infrastructure that had taken decades to build was destroyed in months. Educational systems collapsed, leaving millions of children without schooling. Healthcare systems disintegrated, creating public health crises that persisted long after the fighting stopped. The economic devastation was equally staggering. Congo's GDP, already severely damaged by Mobutu's kleptocracy, collapsed further during the wars. By 2003, most Congolese were living in absolute poverty, surviving on less than $1 per day. The formal economy had largely ceased to function, replaced by subsistence agriculture, barter systems, and black market trading. Perhaps most tragically, the conflicts had been entirely preventable. The immediate cause was Rwanda and Uganda's refusal to accept that Congo was a sovereign state with the right to control its own territory. The deeper causes were the same issues that had plagued Central Africa since colonialism. Ethnic tensions deliberately exacerbated by political leaders, competition for natural resources, and the international community's indifference to African suffering until conflicts became too large to ignore. The Congo Wars demonstrated how quickly even large, resource-rich countries could descend into chaos when governance collapsed. They showed how regional conflicts could spiral into continental wars when neighboring countries pursued military solutions to political problems. Most importantly, they revealed the limitations of international institutions designed to maintain peace, but lacking the will or resources to enforce it when wealthy countries' interests weren't at stake. By 2006, Congo was technically at peace for the first time in a decade. Joseph Kabila had been elected president in what most observers considered credible elections. The transitional government had successfully integrated former enemies into a single administration. UN peacekeepers were deployed throughout the country. International donors were providing aid for reconstruction. For the first time since Mobutu's fall, there was genuine reason for optimism about Congo's future. But the underlying problems that had caused decades of conflict remained largely unresolved. Weak institutions, ethnic tensions, resource competition, and interference by neighboring countries. The peace was fragile, dependent on continued international support and the good faith of leaders who had spent years fighting each other. Whether Congo could finally break its cycle of violence and build a stable, prosperous future remained very much an open question. Chapter 6: Modern Challenges and Future Hope. As we reach the end of our journey through Congo's complex history, we find ourselves in a moment of cautious optimism mixed with familiar challenges. The 21st century has brought Congo both unprecedented opportunities and persistent problems that echo centuries of exploitation and conflict. Today, the Democratic Republic of the Congo sits at the center of the global energy transition, controlling the minerals that power our smartphones and electric vehicles, while still struggling with poverty, conflict, and the weight of its traumatic past. Joseph Kabila's presidency from 2006 to 2019 represented both continuity and change in Congolese politics. On one hand, he successfully consolidated peace, rebuilt institutions, and positioned Congo as a functioning democracy. On the other hand, his rule increasingly exhibited the authoritarian tendencies that have plagued Congolese leadership since independence, culminating in a constitutional crisis that nearly derailed the country's democratic progress. Kabila's first term was generally viewed positively by international observers. He focused on reconstruction, worked to integrate former rebel groups into the national army, and maintained the peace agreements that had ended the Congo Wars. Economic growth resumed for the first time in decades, driven primarily by mining exports and international aid. Infrastructure projects began restoring roads, schools, and hospitals that had been destroyed during years of conflict. The 2011 elections marked a turning point. While Kabila was declared the winner with 49% of the vote against opposition leader Etienne Tshisekedi's 32%, the election was marred by widespread irregularities and violence. International observers questioned the credibility of the results, and post-election protests resulted in dozens of deaths. More troubling for Congo's democratic development, Kabila had changed the constitution just months before the election to eliminate the requirement for a runoff vote, allowing him to win without an absolute majority. During his second term, Kabila faced growing challenges that tested both his leadership and Congo's democratic institutions. Armed groups continued operating in eastern Congo, particularly the M23 rebellion led by Tutsi commanders with apparent Rwandan support. The rebellion briefly captured the major city of Goma in 2012, demonstrating the continued fragility of peace in the region and the limits of the central government's authority. More significantly for Congo's political future, Kabila's relationship with democratic norms began deteriorating. Press freedom declined, opposition leaders were harassed, and civil society organizations faced increasing restrictions. When his constitutional mandate was set to expire in December 2016, Kabila showed no signs of preparing to step down, instead arguing that elections needed to be delayed for logistical and security reasons. The 2016 constitutional crisis brought Congo to the brink of renewed conflict. Kabila's supporters claimed that organizing credible elections would be impossible given security challenges in eastern provinces and technical difficulties with voter registration. Opposition groups accused him of manufacturing excuses to remain in power indefinitely, following the pattern of other African leaders who had manipulated constitutions to extend their rule. Street protests erupted across the country as Kabila's mandate expired without elections being held. The government's response was swift and brutal, with security forces killing dozens of demonstrators and arresting hundreds more. The Catholic Church, which had mediated previous political crises, attempted to broker a compromise between the government and opposition, but negotiations repeatedly stalled over fundamental questions about Kabila's intentions. International pressure intensified as the crisis deepened. The United States and European Union imposed sanctions on Kabila's associates, while regional leaders warned that Congo's instability could destabilize the entire Central African region. The African Union and Southern African Development Community attempted diplomatic interventions, but Kabila skillfully played international mediators against each other while buying time to consolidate his position. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Kabila's own political calculation that remaining in power had become more costly than stepping down. By 2018, his popularity had collapsed, his economy was struggling, and international isolation was threatening Congo's access to foreign aid and investment. In August 2018, Kabila announced that he would respect the constitution and not seek a third term. The 2018 elections were chaotic, violent, and controversial, but they ultimately produced Congo's first peaceful transfer of power since independence. Kabila's preferred successor, Emmanuel Ramazani Shadary, finished a distant third behind opposition candidates Félix Tshisekedi and Martin Fayulu. When the Electoral Commission declared Tshisekedi the winner, many observers suspected a deal between Kabila and Tshisekedi to prevent the more radical Fayulu from taking power. Félix Tshisekedi's inauguration on January 24, 2019, marked a historic moment for Congo and Africa. The son of longtime opposition leader Etienne Tshisekedi, who had died in 2017, Félix represented both continuity with Congo's democratic struggle and the possibility of generational change. Unlike previous transfers of power that had occurred through coups or assassinations, this was a constitutional transition validated by popular vote. Tshisekedi inherited a country with enormous potential and equally enormous challenges. Congo's economy had grown significantly during Kabila's rule, but most Congolese remained desperately poor. Infrastructure remained inadequate despite years of investment. Eastern provinces continued experiencing periodic violence from armed groups. Most fundamentally, Congo still struggled with the same basic question that had plagued it since independence: how to build effective institutions that could govern such a vast, diverse, and resource-rich country. The new president's early initiatives focused on fighting corruption, improving governance, and addressing the humanitarian crisis in eastern Congo. Tshisekedi pardoned political prisoners, allowed greater press freedom, and promised to investigate questionable mining deals signed during the Kabila era. He positioned himself as a reformer committed to transparency and good governance, contrasting with his predecessor's increasingly authoritarian style. However, Tshisekedi's reform agenda was constrained by political realities. Kabila's party controlled the National Assembly, forcing the new president into an uncomfortable coalition with his predecessor. Many observers suspected that Kabila retained significant behind-the-scenes influence, particularly over security forces in the mining sector. This power-sharing arrangement limited Tshisekedi's ability to implement dramatic changes. The persistence of conflict in eastern Congo remained one of Tshisekedi's greatest challenges. Despite decades of peace agreements and international interventions, armed groups continued controlling territory, exploiting mineral resources and terrorizing civilian populations. The resurgence of the M23 rebellion in 2022, with apparent Rwandan support, demonstrated that the fundamental causes of instability had not been resolved. Yet alongside these familiar challenges, Congo in the 21st century faces unprecedented opportunities. The global transition to renewable energy and electric vehicles has made Congo's mineral resources more valuable than ever before. The country controls approximately 70% of the world's cobalt reserves, essential for lithium-ion batteries. It also possesses significant deposits of lithium, copper, and other minerals critical for green technology. The scale of Congo's mineral wealth is almost incomprehensible. The US State Department estimates the total value at $24 trillion, more than the GDP of the United States and China combined. This represents an opportunity for development that could transform not just Congo but the entire African continent, if managed properly. The challenge is ensuring that ordinary Congolese people benefit from this wealth, rather than seeing it extracted for the benefit of foreign corporations and local elites. China has emerged as Congo's most important economic partner, signing a massive $6 billion infrastructure for minerals deal in 2007. Chinese companies now control most major mining operations in Congo, while Chinese investment has funded roads, hospitals, and schools. This relationship has provided much-needed development financing, but has also raised concerns about debt sustainability and environmental protection. The human cost of Congo's mining boom remains troubling. Much cobalt extraction occurs through artisanal mining involving dangerous working conditions, environmental pollution, and widespread use of child labor. International pressure has grown for technology companies to ensure their supply chains are free from human rights abuses, but implementing meaningful reforms remains challenging in a country with weak governance and desperate poverty. Environmental concerns add another layer of complexity to Congo's development challenges. The country contains the world's second-largest rainforest, crucial for global climate regulation and biodiversity conservation. Mining operations threaten this ecosystem through deforestation, water pollution, and habitat destruction. Balancing economic development with environmental protection represents one of the most difficult policy challenges facing Congo's government. International efforts to support Congo's development have had mixed results. Billions of dollars in aid and debt relief have helped rebuild basic infrastructure and institutions, but fundamental problems persist. The United Nations peacekeeping mission, one of the largest and most expensive in UN history, has helped maintain stability but has not addressed the root causes of conflict. International intervention has sometimes created dependency rather than self-reliance. Perhaps most encouraging has been the growth of Congolese civil society. Despite repression and intimidation, activists, journalists, and community organizations continue working for human rights, transparency, and peace. Religious organizations, particularly the Catholic Church, have played crucial roles in mediating political crises and advocating for democratic values. Women's groups have led efforts to address sexual violence and promote gender equality. The 2023 elections demonstrated both progress and persistent challenges in Congo's democratic development. Tshisekedi won a second term, but the election was marred by logistical problems, violence, and credible allegations of irregularities. Opposition candidates rejected the results, and post-election tensions revealed that Congo's democratic institutions remain fragile despite 2 decades of formal democracy. Looking toward the future, Congo faces fundamental choices about its development path. Will it continue following the extractive model that has enriched foreign companies and local elites while leaving most citizens in poverty? Or can it develop a more inclusive economy that processes raw materials domestically, creates jobs for ordinary people, and invests mining revenues in education, healthcare, and infrastructure? The answers to these questions will determine not just Congo's future, but Africa's role in the global economy. Congo's success in managing its mineral wealth sustainably and equitably could provide a model for other resource-rich African countries. Failure could perpetuate cycles of exploitation and conflict that have plagued the continent since independence. What gives reason for hope is Congo's extraordinary resilience. Despite everything, colonial brutality, Cold War manipulation, dictatorship, war, exploitation, the Congolese people have survived, maintained their cultures, and continued building communities. They have produced world-renowned artists, athletes, and intellectuals. They have preserved one of the world's most biodiverse ecosystems. They have maintained democratic aspirations despite repeated disappointments. Congo's story is ultimately about potential, the potential of its land, its resources, and most importantly, its people. Whether that potential is realized depends on choices being made today by Congolese leaders, international partners, and the global community. The country that has given so much to the world, its labor, its resources, its cultural contributions, deserves the chance to finally benefit from its own wealth and build the peaceful, prosperous future its people have long sought. From the ancient kingdoms of the Congo Basin to the modern challenges of the 21st century, this vast country has been shaped by geography, history, and the choices of countless individuals. Its future remains unwritten, full of both promise and peril. But if history teaches us anything about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it is that its people possess remarkable strength, creativity, and determination that may be the most valuable resource of all.